So a slight, another change here, but getting to the as we think about the myth of the way education is played out, everybody going to college, the only way that, you know, even now we've conflated what college is really for versus, you know, training, which is now increasingly what colleges do. You go to college to get trained. If someone is not going to go to college to get trained, or ask you this way, is there are there other alternatives to going to get a technical or a sort of vocational education at college? Can you do it a different way?
Yeah, you should be. Well, in many ways you can do it a different way. And if this were as free a country as it ought to be, you would be able to do it in a lot of different ways. A lot of times there are things that we could do if there weren't regulations. You know, and I'm speaking of mentorship, apprenticeship, hands-on training that way. And you'll find that there are all sorts of employers, there are all sorts of people who take an eager young college student on over the summers and say, yeah, I'll teach you how to, I'll teach you how to do the architectural drawings, and you know, I'll teach you how to do that. But in many cases, it's against the law. You know, it's against the law, or it's going to violate some regulation or other. But I believe there's a lot more that we could. I think there's a lot more that we could do that is not yet restricted, that we should be thinking in terms of apprenticeship, mentorship, taking people under your wing and saying, okay, let me check out on this. Let me help you with that.
Okay. Another area of interest to me when it comes to academics is the sort of question of personalism in education. We live in a time when you know, Enlightenment's at its sort of heyday, and education is sort of seen as, you know, going to take all these classes, get your facts all in order,
get the data dump.
Right, exactly. And if I think all the things we've been saying would point us kind of in a different direction. What is the place of personalism in education, and you know, how should a student who's thinking about college value that as part of their training?
Yeah, this is a big deal, because, and it goes back to what I would say about balance. It's always easy when our society starts to veer in one direction and starts to go in the right ditch to make sure that we go in the left ditch as a way of compensating.
Sure.
So, for example, behind your question is a very common question today is distance learning. You know, so can I go on the internet and check websites and sign up for a webinar?
Absolutely.
You know, so but what am I missing? In Luke 6, the student becomes like his teacher, and if I'm teaching online classes, my life is not really engaged with the lives of my students the way it would be in a community where I'm able to interact with them and talk to them after class and so forth. So I believe that the Bible requires personal interaction as a component of education. But we don't want to embrace that in such a way to outlaw all forms of distance learning. Because the book of Ephesians is distance learning. Distance learning. I've been shaped by the teaching of the Apostle Paul, even though I've never met him. Augustine's City of God that you mentioned, that's distance learning. It's just an old techie form of distance learning. So Augustine has a thought in his head, and he writes it down on paper in one language, and then centuries and centuries later, I'm extracting in another language those same basic thoughts. Or if I'm doing it right, I'm extracting the same basic thoughts off of the page. Well, that's distance learning. So I don't have a problem with overcoming distances with letters or phone calls or websites or that sort of thing. But it always has to be in conjunction with face-to-face. So you'll see in the Bible, I wish I could be with you and lay this out face-to-face. This will do, but I would prefer to be face-to-face, and so you can hear my tone when I'm pleading with you. I think you learn a lot more. You know, I've sent Timothy, and he'll remind you of my manner of life and how you ought to imitate me. And so true discipleship is a function of imitation, and you can't fully imitate. You can partially imitate from a biography, but you can't fully imitate unless you're learning from someone. So I would say, if you're so there are people, computer geeks, who are learning everything on the computer, but we've always had that kind of person. They were up in the library. We called them bookworms. And you know, and so this is not a new problem. It's just going at a faster rate of speed. but it is a problem. So I would say, again, balance. You want to, if you have a heavy component of distance learning, whether it's books or online education, if there's a significant component of that, you want to make sure that you intrude yourself into some sort of human society where people will irritate you. And, or they will
challenge
you, and you will irritate them, and they will, and that, because that's the Holy Ghost's sandpaper. That's what takes the edges off.
Right, right. So, is there any, I guess, along that line? One of the ways I think, particularly with secular universities, when people maybe ask the question, should I go to a secular university, and not making that a right or wrong necessarily decision, but one of the things that's not often contemplated is if Christian worldview makes a difference top to bottom, and the world is a personal place, not an impersonal one,
right,
then how education happens. You can look at the roster of classes and see all the subjects you'll be learning, but that's not the whole story when it comes to what the experience of the college will be like.
There's a James K.A. Smith has got a book called Desiring the Kingdom, which has a lot of good stuff. I differ with some things in there, but there's one point that I thought was fantastic, and that was education is about formation, not information. And of course, information is necessary to formation.
Absolutely.
But formation takes place, in my mind, it takes place on the football field, and it takes place when you've got a coach who takes you aside, and it takes place when you're staying up late and someone talks to you about time management. It's the personal interaction.
Right.
The formation is the key.
It's the way your teachers model interaction with the material that you're actually studying.
Right. Do they love it?
Right.
You know. So if you have a teacher who's got pi memorized out to 178 places, and declaims on that with exuberance,
right,
that would be that's a good thing.
Right.
You're going to get people whipped up about math, and I like to define good teaching as a teacher loving the subject in the presence of students whom he also loves. So if you love the subject and love the students and you talk about it, then you're introducing them to each other.
Right. Very good. I agree with that.